Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today for CALRC. A very impactful message. Really appreciate, our panelists coming to speak about something so safe to home. Encourage all of you to check out some of the posters in the atrium, exploring nature-based solutions. And, here at CALRC, we're also trying to give people practical steps forward, to ask the questions about their own backyards. Is there anything they can do with bioremediation? How do they keep themselves and their family home? Really we just try to meet all of our, our clients, the people that need support where they are, and try to give them comfort during this rough time. So please enjoy the atrium. But now it is my pleasure to bring to the stage Allison Torbett, partner and environmental team co-leader with Nixon Peabody, to discuss residual contamination, managing and mitigating future risk. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm excited for the conference and for seeing you all at this presentation. The idea for this came about in that, as we mentioned at the developers panel, so many sites have low threat closures or residual contamination of some sort. I think Jim asked the question, when you go through the options, do you remove everything or do you leave a little bit of extra and then have long-term management goals? And all three developers kind of chuckled about it and said, actually, there is no option. You usually do both. So here is actually to dive into that a bit deeper, to say, hey, sometimes there are options to have long-term management. What does that look like? How do you actually weigh these options? And then when you go through the long-term process and go, like, say, 5, 10 years down the line, you're trying to refinance a property or you're trying to sell to some new buyer, and they're like, whoa, this site has, phase 1, it's got a phase 2, it's got a wreck. What do we do about this now? And I see a lot of clients, I represent both lenders and developers, that are in this position where we have environmentally complicated properties, as this whole conference is about. And we get there and we're like, hey, how do we actually go through this and get this property to actually sell, get someone to actually come and develop it, or renovate it and make it new again, so it's some blighted, older apartment building? And how do we get that process? So this whole discussion today is on that residual contamination. So I'm Allison Torbett. I'm a partner at Nixon Peabody in our San Francisco office. I co-lead the environmental team nationwide. I have quite a few members here today at the conference, so thank you for coming and excited to have you here. And I brought with me two of great consultants that I've worked with before on actual properties. And we'll have real life examples here today for you on each of these aspects. So Leah Rebelle from Rambles here with me, as well as Chris Spangler from Chris Spangler Strategies. So you'll see real-life examples, again, on this residual contamination issue. So our discussion today is when is clean not achieved? So you have, as we say, the brownfields, greenfields being never developed, but these brownfield sites that have some sort of contamination, whether it's residual at the end, you've already cleaned it up to low threat, or maybe something that's kind of a minimal contamination that's not quite there. So what are those continuing obligations under CERCLA? What do you actually have to do by law in order to continue to get those defenses, to get the ECRG grants if round 3 ever comes back? But at least to get the UST fund, other obligations like that. We'll talk about environmental land use restrictions, so what do those look like and how they can differ between the different agencies. We'll do some long-term management options and those residual contaminants, and how do you actually do these plans and then actually implement them, the more important part, as well as some actual real-life examples of success. And then we'll discuss about the options and cost-benefit scenarios that you should be doing as a developer or as a city, talking about how are you going to actually think about this in the long term and those costs over 20, 30, 50 years. How do you actually reserve money for that and make sure it actually happens? So we'll start with the legal part, get some of the boringness out of it. Looking under CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act. It's usually called Superfund for those non-lawyers in the room, to make it really short. So you have 3 main defenses under CERCLA. This is the reason why you do the phase 1 within 180 days before the transaction closes, is to get these 3 main defenses: the innocent purchaser defense, the contiguous property owner, and the bona fide prospective purchaser. So that's a whole other panel. I actually think Jennifer Novak said some great webinars. She's right in front of me. So you can read all about those defenses. But one of the main part of keeping those defenses is actually doing your appropriate care and taking reasonable steps. This is something that's kind of a weird nuance in law that I actually don't see that often covered in conferences like this, which is why I had the idea of having it today. So the main three parts of that defense of reasonable steps is that you stop any continuing release, you prevent a threatened future release, and then you prevent exposure to a release that's already happened. So that's that residual contamination. So what do these reasonable steps actually look like in real life? It's usually the landlord that's monitoring the lessee to say, hey, are they doing any improper practices? So I'm sure today at this conference you've learned about like vapor intrusion mitigation systems. A lot of those are actually on the ground of the properties. You then have tenants move in. And say they want to start drilling down below the ground. It happens more often than you think. And they penetrate that vapor intrusion mitigation system barrier. And all of a sudden now, this great mitigation system you have is no longer doing its job. You're having people exposed. And that can get you to regulatory trouble, as well as potential litigation. So it's also finding out newly discovered releases. How do you respond to that? Notifying regulators when the authorities, when you find those new releases. Cooperating with neighbors, maybe there's a neighboring release when it comes over. That's a reasonable step. It's restricting site access. So maybe you have a vapor extraction system on the side of the property, and making sure that is actually secured, doesn't get stolen or vandalized, I've seen on other properties. And then thinking about maintaining those existing elements that respond to action. So that could be the cap. A lot of sites will have a contaminated property that'll be capped over, say with an asphalt cap. It's making sure that's actually being maintained, any cracks are being slurried each year. Assessing the extent of contamination if there is a discovery. So if you, something new that comes up, you're digging down somewhere and all of a sudden something unknown arises, actually going through and saying, hey, investigating that, going through the entire process again. And the last preventing exacerbation of contaminated site conditions. And I'll give an example on that last one. So, an example here on the case law of taking or not taking appropriate care. So one example on the left is I say stormwater gets people all the time. So I've gone to sites, they have stockpiles lined up. They thought, they removed it, say, to do some renovations, put in better foundations, do some seismic work. And here's now a stockpile outside exposed to the elements with some residual contamination. It's low threat closure, so it should not be it's not really hazardous waste necessarily, but it definitely still has some residual contaminants so you don't want to expose the public to. And there it is, just sitting there to dust the neighbors, potential stormwater contamination down to the ground. Those are the things that are not taking appropriate care. So that's when you need to make sure it's covered, make sure it's actually monitored each time it's really windy. These are the things that come up all the time that we as lawyers go like, uh-oh, now you really need to call us, make sure you get involved, help you to get out of that problem. The opposite example of that is the other case that's here for you, Imperial LLC, where they went through and determined that yes, someone did take appropriate care. They let the neighbors in, they let the regulatory agencies in, they did their proper investigation and proper cooperation. So you got both cares, some examples of what you should be doing to take care of that residual contamination. So what actually is those reasonable steps? How do those come to be and determine what's appropriate for your site? It's by drafting plans, and there's many types of plans. I gave some initial examples here in the acronyms because this entire field is covered in acronyms, as you all know. And you'll see different things. Sometimes the SMP is a site management plan, sometimes it's soil mitigation plan, STAME, SMP acronym, very annoying. But we're actually going to big detail into that with Leo here next, so he'll talk about that kind of more detail on that side of it. But for me, on the legal side of it, one of the things you mostly do is an environmental land use restriction, a LOR, sometimes they call them, or under the low threat closure process. So what that looks like is a covenant that's actually recorded on the property. So it actually go to the county assessor's office, you record it, you say, here's what restrictions you can't do with the land in the future. And it's to protect the public health and safety or the environment when there is this residual contamination. Again, it runs through the land, so it's there recorded on title, just like any other title impediment. So any future buyer will see it. You also have a requirement to notify usually the tenants that come in the future that might be there. And that's not only on their initial lease, but also on the renewal of that lease. So that's kind of a continuing obligation yet again to make sure people know there is this residual contamination that they could be exposed to in the ground. Why do you do these covenants? Even though it's being recorded on title and definitely could potentially arguably is lowering the property value, it's because you're getting that low threat closure. So you're in this regulatory process with DTSC, the water board, or a local oversight agency. And this is a way to actually get that closure, stop the monitoring, long-term monitoring, or hopefully minimize it to a very short, multi-year process, and get that closure. So there is a whole low-threat closure policy. It's very detailed. But again, looking at that future process, it's assuring that these long-term measurements are attained and that you have the regulatory oversight if something goes wrong or is unexpected. These are heavily negotiated usually, but each agency has its own standard template that you use, and you can go through what is and is not there. So here's two examples, both of which I've recorded on properties I've worked on. Because public data mint, because it's now recorded. You've got two examples from different agencies. One obviously is very simple. It's actually the most common way I see, where it's, we're going to have prohibited uses that on this property that's now capped. So say there's a residual contamination that's now subsurface, there's no longer exposure, we believe, to future occupants. And so they'll say, hey, if it's commercial or industrial property, for example, they'll say no residential, no hospitals, no public or private schools, and no daycare centers. And that's the very common one. It's very simple. And then you, as a potential buyer in the future, go back through and say, hey, this was prohibited uses. Is this actually what's going on now? The example on the right is from a local oversight agency of what they required for one of my sites. And you can see it's a huge laundry list of things. It gets to be much more, it's the same sort of issues as before, the hospital use, daycare center, but it gets a bit more detailed. And then going through that check, it's almost like a checklist. So you as a property owner, making sure these things are actually continued to be followed. And then looking through that and making sure that, hey, are we actually going to do this? And one thing I noticed here on this one, this was a residential site, is you get near the end and you see raising of food prohibited. So it's an affordable housing complex. You have everyone move in, 5 years down the line. If anyone starts growing some fruits and vegetables in their backyard, is anyone looking at that? How do you, as a landowner, actually notice that? And then now you're trying to sell the property, and we're coming in doing due diligence on behalf of the lender or the new buyer, and we're doing, we do our phase one once again, walk around, get pictures back, and like, oh, look, someone's growing fruits and vegetables right there. That's exactly a prohibition of the covenant, and it comes back to haunt you yet again. So I think so many of these things we put into place, you record on the property, you walk away, you have these great plans that no one actually reads. 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, you're like, me as a buyer might come in and representing the buyer and say, hey, can I have a copy of your site mitigation plan or your soil and groundwater management plan? I'm like, oh, I'm not even sure where that is. And we've had multiple clients that can't even find those plans. So no matter how well they've been written, you have to actually find them, implement them, and continue to keep them as part of those property records as you go forward. So I gave you some more examples here on what does this look like, these land use restrictions. I had a site which we did a lead consolidation cell, or an LCC, where basically had lead contaminated property. Instead of paying to get it disposed of off-site, which was very expensive there as hazardous waste, we actually took it and buried it down 10 to 15 feet below the soil. We didn't have demarcation material on top, so that way if you were to hit it, you would know you hit this orange demarcation fabric. And then we did annual visual site inspections to save its property. I have another site that has a cell that's been there for almost 30 years. And on that one, we actually go ahead and have to measure every single year to see if the soil has subsided at all. And that's an area with subsidence. That would be an example of an actual annual survey to say, hey, is this cell still intact likely? There's also often vapor intrusion mitigation systems, and they'll have engineering controls and monitoring systems with the sub-slab barrier vapors, where there we had to go in and again make sure that it's actually doing its job, continuing to operate. The tenants are not penetrating that soil. And again, Leo will go into more detail on these sort of example of plans later on. But once you have the plan, it gets put into the covenant, and then you actually have to make sure the covenant is actually being followed. I'll give you a bit more detail on that as well, but I want to go a little bit faster again. You'll get some more detail on this on Leo, and you'll have the slides if you have more questions. So one example that we want to all talk about is financial assurance mechanisms. This is something that the regulators require often as part of that low-threat closure. They're called FAMs. You have right there the 5 main ways of how you actually have a financial assurance mechanism recorded on title. But it's a whole question usually about how much that money is. Sometimes it can be significant, and it's reserved, over time, and then do you actually cut back on it or not? Usually it's just a static amount that somehow gets put aside to pay for these long-term management plans. Sometimes it's 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. This is where you get your attorneys involved. We help to negotiate for you, hopefully a reasonable amount that we can defend, but it is not so significant that it's going to no longer qualify your project. And this is one where if you are a city or county and then you're going to sell to a developer, they will come in and hopefully take over that financial assurance mechanism. So we get a lot of questions on this. You do have sometimes policies that will change, entity names that will change, and as you go through each process, it's re-upping those financial assurance mechanisms. These were originally part of a landfill process. The idea was that if you're going to start a new landfill or a highly contaminated property, you would have something there to help pay for the cleanup. But this has now been processed and implemented here on many of these low-threat properties to make sure that they also have, financial assurance to actually take care of this long-term plans. I gave you a quick example here today of the two examples between the federal, so if you have an US EPA regulated site versus your California site regulated sites, and how they change. You'll see there's quite a bit of differences between the federal and the state. The state is actually quite a bit stricter. For example, if you're going to do that corporate financial test, which is saying, hey, we have a corporate parent which is very financially able, we actually don't need to put aside money. That's 10 million versus 20 million. It's a pretty big difference there for some small companies. So that's an example as well, and to be aware of the fact that depending on who your regulator is, will change on what the financial assurance mechanism looks like and how you actually implement it. So with that, if I have any questions, I'll take them at the end as well, but I have both Leo and Chris here to present as well. I love being a dirty dirt lawyer. I love taking these properties that are contaminated and going ahead and making them safe for future use. And I hope that today we talked about a little bit, like, what does that look like in future use in 5, 10, 15 years, 30 years in the future? And how do you make sure that future occupants are not exposed improperly? And we're just continuing that process. So thank you very much for coming today, and Leah.
Thanks, Allison. Well, I like being a dirty dirt consultant. So I'm going to talk about some of the favorite subjects of brownfields, soil management plans, and operation monitoring and maintenance requirements in a redevelopment context. So sometimes you have sites that are more just sort of already been redeveloped, but I'm really going to talk about more specifically how they affect, how they come into effect on an actual redevelopment scenario. So just quickly my outline here, talk about some of the OMMP and SMP requirements. Then we'll just talk about some types of SMPs and types of O&M plans, and then I'll just do 3 case studies. One's going to be a residential case study, another one's an industrial one, and then the other one is a commercial one. So just kind of show you how they all dovetail together, and then just some closing remarks. So first of all, both O&M and SMPs are integral requirements of brownfield developments. I can't think of a single brownfield where we haven't had to deal with getting a couple of these documents approved. They are typically required for agency closure of your site. However, sometimes if it's a simple site, like an industrial developer might have a site where you haven't found a lot of contamination, but you might have some questions. Hey, maybe you have an underground storage tank that may or may not have existed, or clarifier, or maybe it was an old, just from the industrial uses, there could have been incidental spills, so you want to be prepared for something so you don't hold up the whole development project. So it's usually a good idea just to have an SMP, even if it's a simple site, without being in a closure program. But like I said, most of them do require regulatory approval. Now, one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands is that the more robust you can make your soil management plan and your O&M plans, it'll protect you in the long term, because the more you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's, it'll allow your project to go smoothly in the long run. And then also, if there's ever cost recovery actions, which happens quite frequently in brownfields, you've got a really solid document. So we work with attorneys to make sure those are bulletproof. It's not just an off-the-shelf document, and especially on the complicated brownfield projects. Same thing with the VIMs and the third-party testing. It's going to make sure that those are really solidly prepared, that you're not selecting the cheapest remedy, and then when they are installed, that they're being properly documented, third-party verification is done and documented properly. That's just kind of an aside. Also, once in a while, environmental justice aspects come into play. We found this during the ECRG program. It was very cutting against the grain sometimes when you say, hey, we can leave this contamination in place, it's not going to hurt anybody. But sometimes it has to get removed just because there are some EJ considerations as well. So that's just something that might come into play. And then, as Allison mentioned, financial assurance is a critical component these days, particularly when you're under the regulatory program. Okay, so in terms of SMPs, I classify them really into 4 different types. The first one is sort of your run-of-the-mill SMP we talked about, just kind of more of an off-the-shelf type of an SMP when you have a site that you don't have any known impacts, and it's just a minor sort of normal redevelopment project, not necessarily a brownfield project. The second one is the one that's more typical, where you have known impacts, you've got unknowns, and I'll talk about that in the case study as well. And that's usually done in conjunction with a remedial action plan or removal action work plan. And the third type is a little bit nuanced. It's more of a grading contingency plan. Sometimes there might be a partial redevelopment of a site. So you want to take a kind of a new look at an SMP and really define, like, what are you going to do? There might be utilities in place. There might be remediation infrastructure you have to work around. So really trying to come up with a plan on how you're going to manage what's already there in a redevelopment context. And finally, the soil and groundwater management plans, particularly on sites with shallow groundwater. Particularly, we're seeing that a lot in the Bay Area, where soil and groundwater management plans are required. And again, then typically you would have to have a dewatering plan as well, making sure you're addressing any contamination either in groundwater from the site or any groundwater you're pulling in from other properties around. In terms of O&M plans, it's really 3 kinds. One is for active remediation and monitoring, so vapor extraction systems, groundwater extraction systems, those are going to have long-term O&M requirements. Long-term monitoring of land use covenants and deed-restricted areas, like contamination that's been left in place either under cap or on a property line, those are subject to monitoring and reporting, especially under DTSC oversight if you're under those kind of a program. And then VIMs, vapor intrusion mitigation systems, naturally you're going to have long-term operation maintenance with financial assurance as well. And some of the complicated, many brownfield sites, you're basically having a combination of all 3 of these as well, right? Okay, so case studies. So this is the residential case study. This is a former taxi repair facility not far from here. This is in the city of Gardena. It was a site that's under DTSC and EPA oversight because we had quite a significant impact from PCBs, and then of course lead impact with soil, petroleum, hydrocarbons. There was a soil vapor plume that was coming onto the site, and also a small source on the site as well from the chlorinated solvents. So we prepared an SMP in conjunction with the remedial action plan this is a DTSC-led site, for the non-PCB issues. And so we had to come up with a plan to address DTSC's many concerns because there were many different AOCs. So instead of going back for multiple rounds of assessment and supplemental site investigations, we prepared a robust soil management plan, and we're able to address a lot of the issues that DTSC had through the SMP process. And in this case, we were allowed to leave any soils above residential screening levels in place under clean cover, and with sort of deed-restricted areas like the no backyards. You see in purple, those are concrete backyards. In this case, the HOA ultimately kept responsibility. I'm going to go a little bit quicker. I'm 5-minute warning here. Case study number 2, this one here is the Dyer Road Business Park. It's an industrial manufacturing facility, high concentrations of PCBs that were ultimately left in place here in this capped area. So that was a heavy truck traffic area that had to be specially designed. We had, again, soil management plan that was prepared actually previous to the sale, so actually by the responsible party that ultimately maintained responsibility for soil and groundwater cleanup. But the developer came in and was responsible for SMP implementation through ultimately reimbursement agreement where the developer was getting paid back for any impacts found. And we found a lot of impacts at the time. So this kind of underscores the point I made earlier, is that you really have to have a very robust soil management plan so that you can go back and say, hey, I followed these rules, and when you come back for cost recovery, because costs go up very exponentially, people are going to question, hey, did you have to remove this much soil? Yes, we did, and here's why. And you have to have a really solid documentation, good field notes, lots of video, lots of photographs. It's kind of a lesson learned that luckily we had all that, and it made the process much smoother in the back end. This one, just some examples of where the areas of concern were, and ultimately the cap that did require long-term O&M with both the developer and the responsible party and the developer sharing responsibility for long-term maintenance and monitoring. Okay, and the final case study is Linwood Springs. This is an ECRG-funded project. I've been working on this since 2003. It's a former gas station dry cleaner. We had 13 feet of free product when it first started on the site. This is a Northgate Markets project that's going to be opening later this year. It is, and a Starbucks. And this one is under water board oversight. And because ECRG was involved, we had a big community outreach program as well. And in this particular case, we integrated all the remediation infrastructure, because remediation is not complete by far, into the development footprint. So not only did we have a soil management plan, but we had this grading contingency plan to deal with 23 vapor extraction wells and roughly 23, Eric, I don't know, groundwater injection wells that all had to be managed in conjunction with the development. And so this was a major feat, because we had to integrate with the developer's architect and with the construction company that's obviously very keen to get the project going. And you know, with Starbucks moving in, there's liquidated damages and all kinds of stuff involved. So a lot of effort had to be spent on making sure that this project gets built on time and on budget. So this is an example of some of the wells and the well protection program that we had. The SMP, we only found a small waste oil tank during the remediation, because there was some previous remediation of the underground storage tanks and the dry cleaner and the dispenser islands and so forth. So didn't really find much in the way of impacted soil, but this particular case, the O&M requirements abound. You've got vapor extractions that's going to be active, so there's going to be active O&M. There's going to be groundwater monitoring. There's going to be a VIMS system installed, both active VIMS system on the Starbucks property and a passive VIMS system on the Northgate property, and those are going to have O&M requirements both being managed individually. And so with that, the grand opening is going to be in September for the Starbucks, and November, I hear, for the Northgate. So it's a great place. You should go. It's a fantastic brownfield success story in our books, and 20 years in the making. So, so just real quick closing remarks. Brownfield projects, everybody in this room knows, can be very complex. Each site's unique. We have to deal with persistent chemicals. Those require an additional level of effort, dealing with different agencies, more long-term care and O&M, a lot of emphasis on those. And agency responsiveness and deference is variable, typically unpredictable, depending on state agency, local oversight agency, which area you're in. It can be very different. So really know the area, choose a consultant that has strong relationships with agencies. I think that can help a long ways. And then sometimes these projects require extensive interaction, as I talked about, with the design team, the construction companies, and sometimes the responsible parties, like in the case I showed you, where the RPs have a big say in what's happening, and there's going to be give and take on both ends, and so you're going to be right in the middle as a consultant. So make sure you have all your I's dotted and T's crossed, because it comes back and it'll help you in the long run. And then soil and groundwater management plans, monitoring plans are, obviously you have extra level of complexity when you're dealing with dewatering and so on. And let's see, what else? Soil management plans, integral to obtaining agency sign-off. Again, I don't know many sites where you have brownfield projects that get approved without having O&M plans and SMPs that are integral, and then you will have to work with your attorneys to develop financial assurance mechanisms, as Allison mentioned, that makes sense for the project. And then finally, environmental justice considerations can come into play in terms of what you're actually going to be doing on the O&M side and the soil management plan implementation. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Hello. Excuse me. Hello. My name is Chris Spengler. I'm a sole proprietor consultant. Been remediating brownfields since about 25 years now. And my primary focus is on lead. Lead from burn ash, lead from lead paint, from auto exhaust, et cetera, and historical burn ash. And so, let's see, there we go. I'm starting off with the very extremely complicated stuff that Allison and Leo have been explaining. For lead in soil, there are other options. So what's better than a operations, maintenance, monitoring, and reporting plan is a soil management plan that barely requires any additional maintenance. And like I said, lead is easily the most ubiquitous contaminant out there. It's all throughout our urban areas. It's all throughout suburbia that was, as long as they were developed before the 70s, you've got lead in the yards. And then there's, of course, there's the fires that we all heard about this morning. And through cycles of construction, demolition, construction again, that lead contaminated soil gets spread across the properties, and you end up with a layer of impacted fill soil that you need to deal with. And it often can exceed health risk standards. As Leo mentioned, like a lot of stuff, that they have a cap that's either, concrete, asphalt pavement, or clean soil cap that requires long-term maintenance, observations, reporting, et cetera. But there's another option that you can put it underneath the buildings. And the example I'm going to show you, along with another recent one I did, they were self-directed. So I didn't get agency approval over it. It was the developer's choice. But I have done one with local agency approval and doing extra excavation to bury something. This, what I'm going to explain, is about doing it as part of the construction process to prevent doing a separate excavation and filling and grading operation at extra cost. So the question is, how do you do this? Well, you start with a geotechnical report. If it's a slab-on-grade building, chances are they're going to require over-excavation and recompaction. That means they dig out the soil that's, at a minimum, the undocumented fill, and possibly more. It's usually a 5-foot minimum, but can be different. And they dig it out, and they put it back as engineered fill with certified compaction to make sure that the building is well supported. And that will tell you whether or not this is feasible. So, where am I here? Did that? Okay. So if it's feasible, 5 foot's usually pretty good for this. You then have to dig into the grading plans, the structural plans, the utility plans, and figure out the construction excavation envelope. What are all the deepest points of the excavation? Because you want to keep what you're going to bury below all that. Then you need to figure out how much soil you need to bury. Now, a lot of lead assessments are done by taking samples at the surface, 6 inches down, 12 inches down, and making some declaration of whether or not it exceeds health risk or not. That doesn't work for this, because you're treating the entire impacted fill soil layer as one waste stream. Like, you can imagine that if you dug it all up and put it in a stockpile and then you sampled it, but you're doing that before you dig it up. I do a series of potholes. The little diamonds on there are X or F, or real-time measurements. There's an instrument it's like kind of shaped like a gun. You pull the trigger and push it against the soil. 30 seconds later, you know what the lead is, and a whole bunch of other metals. And so you can figure out the thickness of that fill layer and how bad it is. And then the yellow bar is a composite sample from the bottom of the fill to the top, and then a confirmation sample under it to make sure that your interpretations are correct. Those go off to the lab. And then use that data to create a soil segregation plan. So you've got the site gridded, one pothole for 1,000 square feet, 2,000 square feet, depending on the size of the site and the history. Estimate the fill depth in each one, do the math, and you got your volume that you need to bury. And then you design the plan. And a simple thing, diagram here relative to like a footing. You're going to bury when you do the OX, they excavate it all out down to 5 feet. You pull off, per that plan before, you pull off the top impacting material, set that aside, dig the rest of it down, set it aside, then take the impacting material, put it in the bottom. But making sure you're not going to get into anything where the future excavations are going to hit it. This is the burial footprint, and you want to look out for construction excavations that are going to go deeper than the OX. Elevator pits, in the lower corner there was a foundations for a stairwell that went deeper. Some stormwater BMPs. Dry wells were actually located because the bottom floor was parking, so they drained it into there. So all you have to do is work with the grader to not place any impacted soil in those areas and put just clean material all the way down from the bottom of the OX up. That way you don't have to deal with it later. In this particular project, doing all this work, and I didn't mention, we did excise out a couple hazardous waste spots, a couple burn ash pits that we found along the way, excised those out. They were small stockpiles, exported them, because you don't want to mix that into it. If the hazardous waste is a big issue on the site, then with agency oversight, you can discuss leaving that stuff on site, like Allison's site where they buried hazardous waste 10, 15 feet down. So that's possible to do, but only with agency oversight. This particular effort saved this project $300,000. The savings can be much more, depending on the size of the site. Other considerations, like I said, as far as burying stuff that exceeds health risk standards or hazardous waste, you're going to have to talk to the regulatory agency about using the area of contamination policy that the EPA has and apply it to the site so that you can move that material around and bury it, regrade it. This also doesn't relieve the owner from protecting groundwater or other environmental receptors. So if the lead is leachable and can impact groundwater, this is not the solution. If you've got a bunch of VOCs in there that can create a vapor intrusion issue, it's not the solution. Like I said, in these cases, we only buried soil that met residential standards. So why would we do that? Why would I bother, if it's unrestricted use soil, as the term goes, why would I bother burying that? Because residential standard soil has potentially a lead concentration average of 80. But that means it's going to have concentrations much higher than that, too. in the data set. And at 50, it could be a hazardous waste. At 80, it could fail quite easily. At 100, good chance it'll fail. A couple hundred parts per million, you can bet money on it that it'll fail. And if you just leave it at the surface, let the construction guys grade it and move it around, after they grade their pad and they start digging their footings and they start doing the utility works, landscaping work, it can generate thousands of cubic yards even for a slab on grade building. And for any given stockpile, it only takes one really bad result to make the whole stockpile hazardous waste. And then there's a whole bunch more money that probably was never accounted for in the project that's got to be paid out to get it off to a class 1 landfill or send it to Arizona. And that's what this avoids. If you follow this plan, all your future export will be clean material. And that's the cheapest stuff to get rid of. It's fully protective of future users of the project, minimal obligations, ongoing cost. That's up to the regulatory agency, but it's never going to get touched again until the building's demolished. So, some disclosure on a real estate transaction, maybe an inspection once in a while, but that's about it. It takes advantage of planned construction activities, not creating a new construction activity, and it can save significant amounts of money. Those are things I do. Thank you.
So we got one question for the Whova app that I'll answer first, and then we'll open it up for the MC for more questions, if any from the audience. The question from the app was, how do developers manage the ongoing long-term costs of O&M requirements? So that's kind of a mix of all three of our discussions. The obvious answer is the financial assurance mechanisms. You have to manage them. But the less obvious answer is making sure that those financial assurance mechanisms actually work for you. That's the right amount of money, not too much, because you don't want to put too much aside, and not too little. And part of that is taking a site management plan, making sure it's really defensible to protect the future occupants, and can be actually implemented over the long term. And you think about what that looks like, as well as making sure it doesn't include too much. So one thing I look at when I get a site management plan to review before it's actually approved by the regulators is to say, can we step it down? So if it has annual inspections, for example, okay, you do an annual inspection on the vapor intrusion mitigation system, and it is operating as intended. First year, second year, third year. You don't really need to do it annually anymore, right? So there should be automatic step downs. Same with like those sub-slab probes. Hey, if they come back as non-detect for residential levels, they should be tested maybe every 5 years. And if you do those automatic decreases that don't require regulatory approval over and over, but just in that very first plan, you can actually save on those long-term costs. So myself, when I review those are the things I look for to make sure you decrease those costs straight up. But again, you need a defensible plan. And then also you can think of options like Chris gave you here. We're actually having different options available to you to decrease those long-term management requirements in the first place. You don't even have those costs. So it's kind of thinking out of the box, making sure your setting sets itself up for success. Anything else you guys want to add to that question?
I guess one sort of nuance, sometimes you have sites where O&M is built in because you're just slightly above screening levels. We have a site that we've been talking about with DTSC in Linwood, for example, not the one that I showed you, but another one where their concentrations are quite low, but O&M is going to be part of the program, but only because we have to be precautionary in the beginning, and over time we can probably show that it's not a vapor intrusion risk, and so at that point we can exit out of that O&M program and show that the site is protective. Chris, I don't know if you have anything? Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll run the mic to you, and if you don't mind just standing and introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Jeremy with Murex. Nice to see you guys. I've been seeing some developers get to the O&M stage and hand off the responsibilities for O&M to the HOA in the setting of a residential property. And the HOAs are really not equipped to deal with this. They accept it, They don't know what they're accepting, and they wind up with a $100,000 per year responsibility. The developer is a single-purpose entity. They sell the property, they disappear, and now DTSC is demanding that this work be done. The HOA can neither afford it, and they don't understand it. What should we do?
It's a very good question, Jeremy. I mean, one is to make sure you have good people that are hired by that HOA. So someone that can actually help and continue to watch those costs, making sure it's implemented correctly. A lot of times it kind of gets stuck. I mean, I see that the HOA doesn't know what to do. They don't have that money, as you just said, and then it doesn't get done, which then prevents them from refinancing. It prevents them from selling to the next owner. It gets you in this position where you don't know what to do, and you call the regulator, maybe if you're the adjoining property, for example, and you're like, hey, now I have offsite impacts impacting my property, and this neighboring property's not doing what they want. And then you get to the litigation stage, which is great for lawyers, but bad for everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a handoff, right, between the developer and the HOA. So in the case of the Gardena project, there was a number that was generated for the O&M, which was basically a step-down approach, like with reasonable expectations on how those systems would perform and how we would get to an endpoint. It was a big number still. We had actually provided a fixed price for that work over a 10-year period. They decided not to go that direction and went and just basically hired the HOA. And then we were out of it. They hired some other consultant, and I haven't heard how it's been going after that. But they did have the numbers, and they were supposed to implement that O&M plan in perpetuity as part of the HOA. And if costs increased, because in that particular case there was still incoming groundwater contamination that hadn't been addressed, so there's going to be long-term monitoring of vapor that would continue as well. So there were some uncertainties that then would also turn over, in that case, I think, to the HOA. But that's where the lawyers come in, so the heavy lifting, it does get complicated for sure.
We have, I think, one final question before we head to end for our next sessions.
Hi, Nick Walchuk with
Are you
Ramble.
heckling me?
I promise Leo didn't plant me here. With residual contamination. Is this not on? Oh, sorry. Try not to yell. Question about land use covenants and how your approach is to kind of battling the perception, particularly developers and capital partners who view them as a huge negative and huge burden, even though long-term, in my experience, they can really facilitate getting to an endpoint.
I represent a lot of lenders, so it's usually that when I get back, the lender will say, hey, we just found this land use covenant, we don't want this property. And it's going back to them being, hey, actually, majority of our properties here have land use covenants. It's actually something a positive, because you actually have something to say that you are protecting occupants in the future. So if you can turn that mindset, and hopefully you have good lawyers on both sides, or you at least hire good lawyers, they can help you to change that mindset to be, yes, it's actually a positive. It shows you those guardrails so you can play the game and know what that game is. So I change it that way. It's also going back to the very beginning of that and make sure the covenant is well drafted, that it actually can be implemented, and then it's not too overbearing, but yet it's enough that's there. You can say, yeah, I can check these boxes. The one I gave about the no preschools, no hospitals, that's a very easy boxes to check. To say, hey, we're not doing these things, whenever we plan to do these things here, we can just move on, this is not a big deal. So it's having the right people on both sides, and I do that on both ends. So if I'm selling a property, we'll help to draft letters and memos, kind of like comfort letters on our side, saying this is what this means and does not mean, and you can do that as the buyer as well.
I think I'll just add to that. I think it depends on the land use. If the land use stays the same, it should be an easier lift than if you're going to change it to residential and it's got a land use covenant for industrial. Right? That's a whole other story. So.
But it works. Yeah. Oh, I would add to that. One thing we're seeing a lot these days too is taking that land use covenant and carving it back. So maybe making sure that the covenant's not the entire property, but just a subset of the property of where the contamination actually is. So there's kind of this default effort where you're just like, hey, the whole property's got the covenant, and instead it could just be that smaller area where the contaminants of concern actually are.
Wouldn't you want to parcel that out?
You don't have to, though. Subdivision Act is pretty expensive.
Awesome. Can we get another round of applause for Allison, Leo, and Chris, our great panelists today? They will be here if you have any follow-up questions for them or if you want to use the Whova app. It is my pleasure to announce a 10-minute break now. And our next sessions in this room will have Changing Tides, Coastal Climate Adaptability, and we will have Reviving on a community-driven, culturally aligned collaboration in the Maui Brownfields Project in Section A. Thank you all for joining us.